So picture this. Right now, floating just off the coast of Dubai, there are 5 massive Indian flag ships.
Huge ones.
Yeah, giant. And if you were like standing on the deck of one of them, you'd just see this vast expanse of the ocean and, maybe the distant haze of the shoreline. But down in the holds of these vessels, over 1.7 lakh tons of liquefied petroleum gas.
Which is, just to put that into perspective, that is enough fuel to power the kitchens and the critical industries of India for nearly an entire week.
Right. But here's the thing. These ships, they aren't moving.
Not an inch.
They're just clustered together, essentially parked in the open water, totally paralyzed. And they're not paralyzed because of, like, a mechanical failure or a storm or anything. It's because a military commander, thousands of miles away, just decided to draw an invisible line across a really narrow strip of water.
Yeah.
So welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today's session is incredibly power-packed, so grab your notebooks, put your headphones on, and let's go.
Absolutely. The visual of those stranded ships, it perfectly encapsulates the sheer fragility of the systems we all rely on every single day.
100%.
We so often think of global events and local realities as these two completely separate universes. There's the world of high-stakes diplomacy, military strikes, international summits.
The stuff you read in the international section of the paper.
Exactly. And then there's the world of your morning commute, your grocery bill, the air you breathe. But the stack of sources we are looking at today, which is a massive sweep of geopolitical updates, domestic policy shifts, social analyses from late March 2026, they prove that these two universes are intimately, violently connected.
Connected in ways that directly impact your syllabus, too. For those of you analyzing this stuff day in and day out, you want to understand the mechanics behind the headlines, right?
Yeah.
You want to see the gears turning under the floorboards of the global economy.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to take these massive, abstract shockwaves and track them all the way down to the ground level. We're going to start with that military tension choking the Strait of Hormuz, then watch how that forces a sudden tax overhaul in New Delhi.
It's a crazy domino effect.
It really is. Then we'll pivot to see how, like, a 35-year-old structural engineer is completely rewriting the political rules in Nepal. And finally, we'll examine these really profound internal debates happening right here inside India over regional power, gender identity, and honestly, the very survival of our ecosystems.
It's a phenomenal chain of cause and effect. And to understand the first link in that chain, we really have to look directly at the trigger for those stranded ships, which is, of course, the escalating conflict in West Asia.
Right, which is prime GS paper 2 material, guys, international relations.
Definitely. Because since late February, specifically February 28th, the region has just been caught in this escalating cycle of retaliation, and the diplomatic messaging that's supposedly trying to contain it is completely fractured.
Fractured is probably an understatement. Look at U.S. President Donald Trump. He publicly extended a pause on strikes against Iran's power plants, pushing his deadline back to April 6th. And he even put out a social media post claiming that talks with the Islamic Republic are going, quote, very well. If you just read that post, you'd think, okay, the situation is de-escalating, everything's fine.
But the reality on the ground contradicts that narrative entirely. Iran has flatly, publicly denied holding any direct talks with the U.S.
Yeah, they shut that down fast.
They did. There are intelligence reports suggesting that Pakistan's foreign minister attempted to act as an intermediary, relaying a 15-point peace plan from Washington to Tehran.
Right, playing the middleman.
Exactly. But Iranian state media immediately pushed back. They stated that Tehran just completely dismissed the framework and issued their own counter-proposals. So the diplomatic track isn't just murky, it is actively being disputed by the parties involved.
And while the U.S. is maintaining this supposed pause, the actual combatants in the region are operating with zero breaks, none at all. Israel's defense minister explicitly stated they are ramping up airstrikes.
Which we're seeing play out in real time.
Yeah, we have confirmation from the Israeli military that they successfully struck a heavy water reactor and a uranium processing plant right in central Iran.
And the retaliation for that was immediate. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, they claimed responsibility for targeting massive storage tanks and an oil depot in Ashdod, Israel. But the scope of the IRGC's response is what fundamentally changes the global calculus here.
Because they didn't just stop at Israel.
No, they didn't. They expanded their targeting to include American military infrastructure across the entire region. They specifically hit the Al Dhafra Air Base in the UAE, and they targeted maintenance hangars at the Ali Al Salem Air Base in Kuwait.
Which means the geographic footprint of this war is just rapidly expanding. It's pulling in multiple sovereign territories. And that aggressive expansion brings us right back to that geographical choke point where our story started, the Strait of Hormuz.
The jugular vein of the global energy market?
Exactly. Note this down for your prelims mapping questions. The Strait of Hormuz is critical. Nearly a fifth of the world's total oil consumption passes through this one narrow waterway.
A fifth.
Yeah. And the IRGC has explicitly announced they are turning back vessels that they deem are linked to their enemies. They've unilaterally closed the route to specific vessels, which is, a stark reversal from their earlier promises that ships from friendly nations would be granted safe passage.
Right, which is exactly how you end up with 5 massive Indian-flagged LPG carriers just bobbing helplessly north of Dubai. They are caught in a geopolitical dragnet. They have the fuel, but they don't have the security clearance from a foreign military entity to actually sail home.
And this right here is where the abstract world of geopolitics crashes directly into domestic policy. GS Paper 3, Economy. Because you cannot run a nation of over 1 billion people with a 6-day hole in your energy supply.
No, you absolutely cannot.
The disruption forces immediate structural reactions at the highest levels of government. We saw that reaction almost instantly. Prime Minister Narendra Modi convened this urgent high-level meeting. But what is really interesting about this meeting is who was actually in the room.
Right, the guest list.
Yeah. He specifically called in the chief ministers and lieutenant governors of non-poll-bound states and union territories.
That distinction is so critical because by focusing on non-poll-bound states, the government is attempting to completely decouple this crisis from immediate electoral politics. Right. The message they're sending is that this is a systemic national security issue. It's not a campaign talking point. The mandate from the prime minister was to forge this united Team India response.
And the specific directives were incredibly pragmatic. Secure the supply of fuel and fertilizers, crack down relentlessly on hoarders, and crucially stop rumor mongers.
Because panic is a contagion.
Oh, absolutely. In a crisis like this, panic is just as dangerous as the actual supply shortage. We saw the Union Petroleum Minister, Hardeep Singh Puri, having to forcefully intervene in the public discourse. He had to shut down these rapidly spreading rumors about a potential lockdown due to fuel shortages.
He had to be very firm about that.
He had to label them completely false just to stabilize public sentiment. But, statements in meetings don't alter the mathematical reality of global oil markets.
No, they don't.
So to manage the actual economic shock, the government had to pull one of its biggest fiscal levers. They announced a massive, immediate cut in the special additional excise duty on fuel. They slashed it by 10 rupees a liter on both petrol and diesel.
Which is huge. It effectively pushes the excise duty on diesel down to 0 and petrol down to just 3 rupees a liter.
Now, on paper, if I hear that the government just cut taxes on fuel by 10 rupees a liter, I'm thinking, great, my commute is about to get instantly cheaper. I expect to pull up to the gas station and see the numbers on the board drop. But that isn't happening.
Not at all.
The prices at the pump have not dropped a single rupee. Why? Break this down for us, because this is a classic concept that trips people up.
Yeah, this is perhaps the most misunderstood mechanism in energy economics. And it revolves around a concept called under-recoveries. To understand why your pump price hasn't dropped, you have to look at the massive public sector oil marketing companies in India, companies like IOCL, BPCL, HPCL.
Right.
For months, they have been shielding the Indian consumer from the true cost of the global oil market. So when global Brent crude prices shot past $111 a barrel because of the war...
Which was a massive spike.
Right. These companies didn't pass that massive price spike onto the consumer. If they had passed on the actual real-time cost of acquiring crude oil, refining it, transporting it, the price of fuel at the pump would have skyrocketed overnight.
And because fuel is the foundation of all logistics, right? The cost of literally everything else, food, medicine, basic consumer goods, it would have all surged, triggering this catastrophic inflation.
Exactly. So the oil marketing companies deliberately sold the fuel at a loss.
Okay, let me try to visualize this for everyone listening. It's like, think of the government and these oil companies as the suspension system in a car.
Okay, I like that.
Right. The global oil market just hit a massive jagged pothole. If the car had no suspension, the passenger, meaning the everyday consumer, would violently crack their head on the roof. The economy would fracture. So the oil companies are the shock absorbers. They take the violent kinetic impact of that pothole, compressing and taking damage so the passenger inside barely feels a bump.
That analogy works perfectly. because it highlights the mechanical limit of the system. I mean, shock absorbers can only take so much pressure before they physically shatter. Right now, these companies are facing under-recoveries, which, again, is the technical term for the gap between their cost and their selling price, of about 26 rupees for every single liter of petrol they sell.
Wow.
And for diesel, it is a staggering 81 rupees and 90 paise per liter.
Wait. They are losing over 80 rupees every time someone pumps a liter of diesel.
Yes, every single time.
That's insane.
When you aggregate that across the entire Indian economy, these companies are absorbing a financial hit of roughly 2,400 crore rupees every single day.
Every day.
Yes. That is a hemorrhaging of capital that no corporate entity can sustain. No, it is a life raft for the oil companies. The government is essentially stepping in and surrendering its own tax revenue to keep those companies afloat. The exchequer is taking a massive hit, about 7,000 crore over just the next 15 days, to subsidize these under-recoveries.
Right.
The government is absorbing the blow, so the companies...
Hiking the export duties on diesel and aviation turbine fuel.
Exactly. They're trying to claw back about 1,500 crore from exporters to offset the domestic bailout. But the net charge on central revenues is still a massive 5,500 crore over a 15-day period. It is a...
They've mandated that allocations be increased, but only up to 70% of pre-crisis levels. They are deliberately rationing the supply.
And the rationing is highly strategic. They are employing industrial triage. The priority is strictly given to labor-intensive, essential sectors that rely on specialized heating processes. We're talking industries like steel, textiles, dyes, chemicals, plastics.
Because they literally can't run without it.
Exactly. These are sectors where the technical infrastructure simply cannot swap out LPG for another fuel source without completely halting production.
But for every other commercial entity, restaurants, hotels, lighter manufacturing, the government is aggressively forcing a transition to piped natural gas, or PNG.
Yeah, they are literally telling state governments that in order to receive their full supplementary LPG allocation, they must provide verifiable proof that they are transitioning commercial users to the piped gas grid.
The official line from the government is that, oh, this is not a reaction to an impending shortage. They insist the supply is totally secure and that they're simply promoting PNG because it's a more affordable, convenient long-term alternative.
It's just a nice way to frame it.
Right. But the timing makes the reality completely obvious. The geopolitical bottleneck in the Strait of Hormuz is accelerating India's domestic energy transition at a breakneck speed.
Completely.
So just think about the absolute scale of that connection. A military posture by the IRGC in a waterway near Dubai instantly reshapes taxation in New Delhi, threatens the balance sheets of massive oil corporations, and dictates the exact type of fuel a textile factory in Gujarat is legally allowed to burn.
It's the ultimate demonstration of how intertwined our vulnerabilities are.
Here's a quick memory hook for this section, guys. Jot this down. Hormuz blocks, IOCL shocks, PNG unlocks. Connect the strait, the oil companies, and the domestic shift to piped gas.
That's a great way to remember the sequence. But, managing the energy supply is just one facet of the crisis. India cannot simply turtle up and focus on domestic fuel rationing.
No, it still has to operate on the global stage.
Right, which means navigating a deeply contradictory and volatile diplomatic landscape.
Exactly. When the Middle East squeezes global energy, the ripples hit every single sector. India still has to secure weapons, negotiate complex trade deals, and manage the immediate fallout in its own backyard.
Yeah.
And the strategy India is using to juggle all of this is fascinating, but it also looks incredibly precarious. Let's look at India's defense procurement this week as a prime example of this balancing act.
In a single week, New Delhi signed defense contracts worth 858 crore rupees. But the counterparties to these contracts, they highlight the sheer complexity of India's position.
Oh, totally.
They signed a 445 crore deal with a Russian state agency for the Tunguska air defense missile system. The army desperately needs this to counter low-flying threats like drones and cruise missiles.
Okay, but simultaneously, like in the exact same cycle, they handed a 413 crore contract to the American aerospace giant Boeing.
Yep.
This was for the maintenance, repair, and overhaul of the Indian Navy's P-8I reconnaissance fleet, which are these highly advanced aircraft used for submarine hunting and maritime surveillance.
Exactly. They are buying critical air defense infrastructure from Moscow while simultaneously integrating their naval maintenance protocols with Washington.
I look at these two contracts and it feels like a glaring contradiction. We are funneling hundreds of crores to Russia and the United States at the exact same time, while those two nations are locked in fierce, systemic proxy struggles across the globe.
It's a lot to manage.
How does a country sustain that? I mean, is this a brilliant calculated strategy of playing both sides, or are we just accumulating diplomatic friction until something inevitably catches fire?
Well, you are describing the core philosophy of India's foreign policy, multi-alignment.
Which is very different from non-alignment.
Extremely different. Unlike the Cold War era of non-alignment, where the goal was to stay out of the blocs, multi-alignment is about actively engaging with all blocs simultaneously to maximize your strategic autonomy.
Right.
The logic is purely functional. India's military infrastructure has deep, decades-old dependencies on Russian hardware. You cannot simply unplug from that ecosystem overnight without completely degrading your defense capabilities.
True.
The Tunguska systems are a necessity for the immediate threat matrix on the borders.
But at the same time, the strategic theater of the future is the Indo-Pacific, where China's naval presence is rapidly expanding.
Precisely. And in the Indo-Pacific, the United States offers the most advanced maritime surveillance technology, hence the P-8I fleet. India's argument to the world is that its national interest requires these parallel partnerships.
And so far, both Washington and Moscow have accepted this reality.
They have, recognizing that trying to force India to choose a side might push it entirely into the other camp.
But the friction is undeniably there, especially when we pivot from defense to the economic front. Take trade. We have the External Affairs Minister, S. Jaishankar, currently in France at the G7 meeting, heavily pushing the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, or IMAC.
Right.
The pitch is that we need resilient, diversified trade routes precisely because of the chaos in West Asia. But simultaneously, India's bilateral trade negotiations with the United States are hitting massive roadblocks.
Huge roadblocks. The U.S. and India have been trying to hammer out an interim trade deal, but they are deadlocked over highly sensitive agricultural tariffs, specifically regarding pulses.
Pulses, a massive staple in the Indian diet, and millions of domestic farmers rely on cultivating them. The U.S. wants greater access to the massive Indian market for its own agricultural exports, but India is terrified of undercutting its own farmers.
It is an intensely political issue for both administrations.
Very much so.
And the atmosphere surrounding these negotiations is highly contentious because the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative has simultaneously launched Special 301 investigations against India and several other nations.
Okay, let's break that down because a Special 301 probe sounds like obscure bureaucratic jargon, but the implications are huge.
Yeah.
What exactly is this tool?
Right. Section 301 of the U.S. Trade Act gives the American government the authority to investigate and unilaterally respond to foreign countries that they believe are engaging in unfair or discriminatory trade practices.
Okay.
In this specific instance, the U.S. is investigating allegations of excess manufacturing capacity and the use of forced labor in supply chains.
So if the U.S. determines that India's trade practices violate their standards, they can unilaterally impose massive tariffs or sanctions.
Yes. So visualize the diplomatic environment here. You have Indian trade negotiators sitting at a table with their American counterparts trying to politely agree on the import tax for lentils,
Right.
while another arm of the American government is actively building a legal case to potentially sanction the Indian economy. It is an incredibly aggressive, multi-track diplomatic strategy.
And India isn't just dealing with friction from the West. It is facing severe diplomatic headaches within the alliances it actually champions.
Yeah.
In May, India is set to host the BRICS Foreign Ministers meeting, leading up to the main BRICS summit in September. But currently, they are struggling to even draft a basic, cohesive joint statement.
And the reason for that paralysis takes us right back to our first segment. BRICS recently expanded its membership to include, among others, Iran and the United Arab Emirates.
The exact same Iran and UAE that are currently launching missiles at each other's infrastructure in the Middle East.
Exactly. India, as the chair of the summit, has the impossible task of getting two nations engaged in an active, expanding regional conflict to sit down and agree on a consensus document regarding global stability.
Yeah.
It highlights the inherent weakness of these massive multilateral blocs. When the geopolitical realities on the ground fracture, the diplomatic frameworks built on top of them simply freeze.
It's an impossible position.
Yeah.
But New Delhi doesn't just have to manage global superpowers and massive blocs. It has to manage the volatile shifts happening right on its own borders. Because when the Middle East sneezes, South Asia catches a cold.
Very true.
And that brings us to the political earthquake that just happened in Nepal. Let's look at this, because for anyone tracking border security and neighborhood-first policies, this is vital.
We just saw Balendra Shah sworn in as the new Prime Minister of Nepal, and his profile completely shatters the historical mold of regional leadership. He is a 35-year-old structural engineer who first gained fame as a rapper.
35 years old, that is incredibly young for a head of state anywhere, let alone in South Asia.
It really is.
He ran on the Rashtriya Swatantra Party ticket and secured a near two-thirds majority. And he didn't do it through traditional patronage networks or established party machinery. He rode a massive, undeniable wave of Gen Z protests.
Yeah, the youth voters were completely fed up with the rotating door of aging politicians and the systemic, deeply entrenched corruption.
The generational shift is the defining factor here. For decades, Nepali politics has essentially been a closed loop, dominated by a small cohort of older leaders who just traded power back and forth.
Right.
But the youth demographic has fundamentally different demands. The protests that fueled Shah's rise weren't just about abstract ideology, they were about concrete service delivery. They wanted accountability for why basic infrastructure was failing and why the economy wasn't generating jobs. Shah's landslide victory is a total systemic rejection of the old guard.
I mean, he literally released a rap song called Jai Mahakali just hours after taking his oath of office, and it racked up 3 million views in a single day.
That's wild.
He bypasses traditional media entirely, but the promises he made to secure that mandate are staggering.
Right. Expectations are sky high.
They are monumental. He has publicly pledged to expand Nepal's economy from $45 billion to $100 billion within 5 years and to create 1.2 million new jobs. But he is stepping into the prime minister's office at the exact moment the global economy is contracting.
Right, because of the war in West Asia. Nepal is entirely dependent on imported fuel. Their prices at the pump are surging, and they are already rationing cooking gas.
Furthermore, Nepal has a massive structural vulnerability: remittances. Over 1 million Nepali citizens work overseas, predominantly in the Gulf region.
Oh, wow.
The money they send back home is a foundational tiller of the Nepali economy. If the war in the Middle East disrupts those labor markets or makes it impossible to transfer funds, Shah's ambitious economic expansion plans will be crippled before they even begin.
So from New Delhi's perspective, this is a massive variable. It's about it from a border state perspective, especially for those in Bihar or UP. India is watching a 35-year-old structural engineer with massive popular backing, but facing severe economic headwinds, take control of a critical buffer state between India and China.
It's a very delicate situation.
How does India's diplomatic corps even begin to adjust to this?
It requires a complete recalibration. The old playbooks relied on personal relationships with the established political dynasties. New Delhi now has to engage with a leader who owes no favors to the traditional power brokers, who is highly attuned to public sentiment on social media, and who expects rapid, tangible results.
And Nepal isn't the only neighbor feeling the strain and looking to India. We also have Bangladesh's new foreign minister, Khalilur Rahman, arriving in New Delhi. And his agenda is driven by the exact same pressures.
Bangladesh is facing acute energy shortages. They are actively rationing fuel to preserve their foreign exchange reserves. In fact, India recently had to step in and supply them with an emergency consignment of high-speed diesel just to help stabilize their grid.
Yeah.
The foreign minister's visit is ostensibly to discuss the renewal of the Ganga Waters Treaty, which governs river sharing and turns 30 this year. But the subtext of the entire visit is energy security and economic survival in the face of global instability.
So India's foreign policy apparatus is stretched to the absolute limit.
Yeah.
They're buying weapons from rivals, negotiating fractured trade deals, trying to hold the fractured bricks together, and propping up the energy grids of their neighbors.
It's an exhausting external reality.
It really is. But as we look at the next set of sources, we see that the external pressure is only half the story. The internal architecture of India itself is undergoing massive structural stress testing.
The domestic landscape is equally volatile. A government doesn't just manage its borders, it has to manage the people within them. It has to reconcile deep demographic shifts, allocate political power fairly, and define the fundamental rights of its citizens.
Right.
And right now, those internal debates are reaching a boiling point.
Which brings us to GS Paper 2, polity, and the profound demographic and economic fault lines dividing the country. We have this incredibly stark editorial by Shashi Tharoor that outlines the growing anxiety regarding the North-South divide.
Thoreau frames the divergence perfectly. He contrasts what he calls the Great Indian Plain, the massive populous states of the Hindi heartland in the north against the peninsular states of the south.
Okay.
And the data he presents shows two regions moving on entirely different trajectories.
The core of the issue is the contrast between population density and economic output. The northern states possess the sheer demographic weight. They have higher fertility rates and massive growing populations.
But the peninsular states are the economic engines. Tharer points out that the per capita incomes in the southern states are consistently at least double those of the north.
Double.
At least double. Furthermore, their human development indicators, metrics like life expectancy, infant mortality, female literacy, they are not just better than the national average, they are comparable to upper middle income countries in Europe.
So you have a situation where the South resembles a developed European nation demographically and economically, while the North represents a massive, booming, developing populace. Why does this create a political crisis right now?
Because of the impending census and the subsequent delimitation exercise.
Delimitation. Mark that down, guys.
Yes. Delimitation is the constitutional mechanism of redrawing parliamentary constituencies to reflect changes in population. In a strict one-person, one-vote democratic system, political power is directly tied to population size.
So the southern states are realizing that because they successfully implemented family planning decades ago and stabilized their population growth, which is exactly what the national policy encouraged them to do, they are now going to be punished politically.
Exactly.
They're going to lose seats in parliament to the northern states that did not control their populations.
Tharer captures this deep-seated fear. He warns of a looming scenario where the South begins to view its relationship with the center as almost colonial.
That's a strong word.
It is. The fear is that the South will be treated as an extractive colony, generating the vast majority of the tax revenue and economic growth, but having its political voice completely muffled by the overwhelming demographic dominance of the Hindi heartland.
It is a terrifying prospect for national unity.
How does a democracy reconcile this? I mean, how do you balance the fundamental democratic ideal that every single citizen's vote should have equal weight against the stark reality that certain geographic regions are overwhelmingly subsidizing the development of the rest of the country?
It's the ultimate constitutional headache. Faror suggests a concept called digressive proportionality. Can you break down the mechanics of how that would actually work?
Sure. It is an attempt to mathematically engineer a compromise between population and statehood. In a purely proportional system, a state with 10 times the population gets 10 times the seats.
Simple enough.
Digressive proportionality tweaks that formula. It dictates that larger states will still receive more seats overall, but they will receive fewer seats per capita. Conversely, smaller states will receive fewer seats overall, but more representation per capita.
So it flattens the curve. It ensures the massive states don't hold an absolute monopoly on power while guaranteeing the smaller states retain a meaningful voice. It sounds a bit like how the European Union allocates seats in its parliament.
It is exactly like that. It is a structural compromise designed to prevent demographic tyranny. But, while Tharoor articulates the South's anxieties brilliantly, the sources also force us to look critically at the South's own internal narrative.
Right.
Because the peninsular states are not egalitarian utopias.
Not at all. The analysis highlights deep systemic failures within the Southern model. The wealth that the South generates is heavily concentrated. It describes a middle-income trap, where the massive GDP numbers are driven by a highly extractive economy that benefits a narrow, urban elite.
The geographic concentration of wealth is staggering. The data shows that the economic boom in the South is often limited to just 3 or 4 highly developed urban districts per state.
Leaving the rest behind.
Right. The rural areas are left behind. The daily agricultural wage in these wealthy states has not risen anywhere near proportionately with the overall per capita income.
The sources are blunt about the social realities as well. Despite the high literacy rates and economic growth, the South is still plagued by blatant caste discrimination and deeply entrenched patriarchy. In fact, there are specific districts within these wealthy southern states where the literacy rates actually lag behind some of the poorer districts in Uttar Pradesh.
Wow.
So the South has a massive inclusivity problem of its own.
Which demonstrates that the challenge of governance isn't just about balancing power between regions. It is about how power and protection are distributed down to the individual level. How does the state define who is vulnerable, and how does it legally encode their identity?
Right.
This brings us to a deeply controversial piece of legislation that was just pushed through, The Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Amendment Bill 2026.
This is an incredibly sensitive issue. And I want to be clear for everyone listening that we are exploring the arguments presented in our source material objectively. We're looking at the legal and social mechanics of the debate, presenting both the government's rationale and the deep concerns of the advocates to understand how the state is attempting to define identity.
The fundamental conflict at the heart of this bill is the legal definition of gender. For years, the legal framework in India was heavily influenced by the landmark Nautala versus Union of India Supreme Court judgment.
A super important case to know.
Very important. The core tenet of that judgment was the right to self-identification. It recognized that gender identity is an internal, deeply personal experience, and that individuals had the right to self-identify their gender without requiring medical or biological certification from the state.
But this new 2026 amendment bill, which was passed amidst intense opposition walkouts and widespread protests from the LGBTQIA+ community, it systematically dismantles that principle of self-identification.
It does. The government's stated rationale for overhauling the system is rooted in administrative anxiety. According to the sources, the government argued that the purely self-identified system was vulnerable to misuse.
Misuse how?
They expressed concerns that individuals could falsely claim transgender status to illicitly access public facilities, government employment quotas, and specific welfare benefits earmarked for marginalized communities.
So to prevent this alleged fraud, the new bill mandates a totally different standard for legal recognition. It removes the straightforward self-declaration process and replaces it with a system that demands objective proof.
Specifically, it mandates a reliance on biological markers, requiring medical documentation of chromosomes, hormonal levels, or physical anatomy. Alternatively, it requires verifiable participation in specific, historically recognized sociocultural identities, such as the Kinner, Arvani, Hijra, or Jogta communities.
And this is where the fierce backlash from advocates is centered. The critics argue that this legislative approach fundamentally misunderstands what gender is. By demanding medical proof of biological markers, they argue the state is completely conflating biological sex, which is a physical characteristic, with gender identity, which encompasses psychological, social, and cultural dimensions.
The critique is that the bill applies a rigid, heteronormative lens to a complex human reality. By forcing individuals to either submit to intrusive medical evaluations or prove their membership in very specific traditional cultural groups, the law effectively erases the lived reality of those who do not neatly fit into those narrow, state-defined checkboxes. Advocates argue it rolls back years of progressive jurisprudence and replaces it with a bureaucratic policing of identity. The government, conversely, defends the act as a necessary corrective measure to protect the integrity of welfare systems, claiming it reflects a collective conscience.
It is a profound debate about the limits of state power. Does the government have the right to demand biological proof of how you experience your own identity? And this theme of the state's responsibility to protect the vulnerable extends beyond legislation and directly into the courts.
Yes, it does.
We saw a very forceful intervention from the Supreme Court this week regarding a deeply entrenched failure in the justice system: the casual unmasking of sexual assault survivors.
The Supreme Court was compelled to intervene twice within a single week, issuing severe, unprecedented warnings to trial courts and police departments across the country.
Twice in 1 week.
Yes. The justices expressed outrage at what they termed a general indifference among law enforcement and the lower judiciary toward the legal mandate of protecting survivor anonymity.
It seems almost incomprehensible that the courts themselves would be the ones violating this protection. But the Supreme Court noted that survivor identities were being casually revealed in public case records, in legal affidavits, and even explicitly written into the final judgments issued by lower court judges.
The Supreme Court had to forcefully remind the legal apparatus that this negligence is not merely a procedural oversight, it is a statutory criminal offense.
Guys, make a note of this section. Under Section 72 of the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita, which replaced Section 228A of the IPC, revealing the identity of a sexual assault survivor is a crime punishable by up to 2 years of rigorous imprisonment.
The Supreme Court specifically cited the landmark 2018 Nipun Saxena judgment, which laid out exhaustive guidelines for masking identities. The entire purpose of these anonymity laws is functional. The social stigma surrounding sexual assault is immense. It acts as a massive barrier, silencing survivors and preventing them from seeking justice. When the very institutions designed to protect them, the police and the courts, carelessly broadcast their identities in public records, it destroys any remaining trust.
It creates a massive chilling effect. If a survivor believes that reporting a crime guarantees public exposure by the state itself, they will not come forward. The Supreme Court's intervention was a desperate attempt to force the bureaucratic machinery of the lower courts to recognize the human cost of their administrative negligence.
Absolutely.
If we step back and look at these three massive internal issues, the fear of the southern states losing their political voice, the legislative battle over defining transgender identity, and the Supreme Court trying to stop lower courts from traumatizing survivors, they all revolve around the exact same core conflict.
Your shoes.
It is the friction between the cold, rigid machinery of the state and the messy, vital reality of human beings. How does the state measure your worth? Is it by your population density or your GDP? How does it validate your identity? Is it by your internal conviction or a biological checklist?
The state constantly attempts to engineer clean, standardized solutions to deeply complex, localized realities. And that tension between the master plan and the reality on the ground is not just ideological. It is physically built into the environments we inhabit.
Which is the perfect transition into our final section today. Let's move from the architecture of laws to the architecture of concrete and steel. GS Paper 3, Environment and Ecology.
Right.
We want to look at the massive collision happening between rapid top-down urbanization, the rights of legacy residents, and the physical survival of our ecology. Let's travel to Hyderabad and examine the Musi Riverfront project.
The Musi River is a historic waterway that winds for 55 kilometers right through the heart of Hyderabad, and the state government has unveiled a staggering 6,500 to 7,000 crore vision to completely transform it.
That is a massive budget.
Massive! The blueprints show a world-class riverfront, huge promenades, architectural bridges, vibrant cultural centers, high-end commercial hubs. The aesthetic inspiration explicitly references the Seine in Paris or the Chiangasian Restoration in Seoul.
The renders always look beautiful, don't they? But the execution of this grand vision requires a massive clearing of the canvas, which means displacing the people who currently live there. The government is aggressively acquiring land along the riverbanks, retroactively declaring these areas as mandatory buffer zones. And this is triggering mass evictions. We read about a specific case study in the sources, Madhu Park Ridge.
Madhu Park Ridge is a sprawling residential complex where 417 occupants are currently facing imminent eviction. And the anger is palpable because these residents aren't squatters.
No.
They argue that when their buildings were constructed and purchased decades ago, they went through all the legal channels and acquired the proper municipal permissions. The buffer zones that are now being used to evict them didn't exist in the zoning regulations at the time.
So the state changes the rules decades later, and suddenly your legally purchased home is slated for demolition to make way for a promenade. And the compensation they're being offered is incredibly controversial. The government isn't just handing them cash, they are offering transferable development rights, or TDRs.
Right. A TDR is essentially a voucher. The government takes your land, and in exchange, they give you a certificate that allows you to build additional floor space on another piece of property you might own. Or you can sell that voucher to a developer who wants to build a taller high-rise elsewhere in the city.
But if you are a middle-class family whose only asset was the apartment the government just bulldozed, a voucher to build a skyscraper somewhere else is totally useless to you. And if the market is flooded with these vouchers, their value crashes. It is a financial mechanism that heavily favors large-scale developers, not displaced homeowners.
Exactly. But the controversy over displacement is completely overshadowed by a much deeper structural paradox regarding the river itself. Environmentalists are looking at this 7,000 crore beautification project and asking a very basic question. What exactly are you beautifying?
This is the most staggering detail in the entire stack of sources. Listen to this. The Musi River, in its current state, is not a river. It is an industrial sewer. The data shows it carries roughly 1,800 million liters of raw sewage and highly toxic industrial effluent every single day. And a massive portion of that toxicity comes directly from Hyderabad's sprawling pharmaceutical manufacturing hubs, which dump chemical waste into the catchment areas.
So instead of fixing the foundational plumbing of the city and forcing the multi-billion-dollar pharma industry to treat its waste, the city is essentially trying to spray perfume on a massive flowing chemical spill and charge a real estate premium for the view. The focus is entirely on surface aesthetics, ignoring the deep ecological rot.
And the state's proposed engineering solution to clean the river is almost unbelievable. Because the Musi is so choked with sludge and chemicals that the government plans to artificially flush it.
Flush it with what?
They intend to divert 2.5 TMCFT of fresh water from the massive Godavari River, pump it across the landscape, and dump it into the Musi just to keep it flowing and dilute the toxicity.
To visualize 2.5 TMMFT 1,000,000,000 cubic feet, imagine taking over a billion bathtubs full of pristine, vital fresh water from a healthy river ecosystem and sacrificing it simply to dilute the industrial waste of another city so the new promenades don't smell? Critics point out that this is the absolute antithesis of ecological restoration.
True restoration would mean halting the pollution at its source. It would mean taking on the pharma lobbies and investing that 7,000 crore in massive sewage treatment infrastructure, rather than dredging the sludge to build commercial hubs. It is a perfect example of how top-down infrastructure projects often prioritize real estate valuation over actual livability.
We see a similar reliance on top-down engineering solutions to environmental crises playing out right now in Delhi. The Commission for Air Quality Management, the CAQM, is rolling out strict new mandates starting April 1st in an attempt to combat the severe choking dust pollution that blankets the national capital region.
Dust from massive construction and demolition is a primary driver of the air quality crisis in Delhi. So the CAQM is mandating a highly regimented system. Municipal corporations are now required to establish designated scientifically managed collection points and processing centers for all construction waste within every single 5 by 5 kilometer grid of the city.
And they are relying heavily on surveillance technology to enforce it. They are implementing mandatory GPS tracking on all vehicles transporting this waste to ensure it isn't illegally dumped on the outskirts of the city. It is a highly controlled, bureaucratic attempt to manage human activity and its environmental fallout.
But the underlying lesson in all these sources is that human activity and nature itself rarely conforms neatly to bureaucratic rules. Life is remarkably adaptable, and it will exploit whatever gaps exist in the system. To see a profound example of this adaptation, we have to look at the deeply counterintuitive wildlife crime data coming out of Punjab.
When you think of organized, large-scale wildlife poaching, you naturally picture dense, impenetrable jungles and remote forest reserves. You think of central India or the Northeast. You do not think of Punjab.
No, not at all.
Punjab is one of the most heavily cultivated agrarian states in the country. Forest cover constitutes a mere 3.6% of its total geographical area.
There are barely any forests, yet a new, comprehensive study has identified Punjab as a massive emerging hotspot for international wildlife crime. How is that mechanically possible?
It is possible because the illicit networks do not rely on forest cover. They rely on logistics. The smugglers have realized that enforcement agencies are intensely focused on guarding the jungles, so they have adapted. They are using the massive, highly developed agrarian transit networks of Punjab, the highways, the railway junctions, the border crossings as their primary corridors.
The scale and variety of the smuggling are shocking. Researchers documented extensive operations involving wild boars hunted for the illicit bushmeat trade. They uncovered the massive seizure of Chatouche shawls.
And Chatouche is a critical indicator of transnational networks. Those shawls are woven from the extremely fine undercoat hair of the endangered Tibetan antelope. Producing them requires killing the animal. The presence of these shawls in Punjab means there are established smuggling routes moving contraband from the high Himalayas down through the plains and out to international markets.
But it gets even stranger. The authorities in Punjab have recovered tiger skins and incredibly smuggled marine species. Marine life is being trafficked through a completely landlocked agricultural state.
Exactly. It completely upends our understanding of how these syndicates operate. They don't need to hide in the trees. They hide in the massive flow of commercial transit. Hubs like Amritsar and the international border point at Atari have become critical nodes. The human element of these illicit networks is highly fluid and adaptable, instantly rerouting to exploit the path of least resistance.
It is a grim testament to resilience. But thankfully, our stack of sources doesn't just leave us with toxic rivers and smuggling rings. There are vital glimmers of hope and profound beauty that remind us of what is actually at stake. Let's travel from the transit hubs of Punjab to the dense, vibrant forests of Arunachal Pradesh.
Deep in the Leparada district, researchers have just recorded a completely new, previously unknown species of butterfly.
They're proposing to name it the Euthalia subingargi, or the Baisar Duke, in honor of the late legendary cultural icon of Assam, Zubingarga.
It is a stunning discovery. Amidst all the geopolitical maneuvering, the economic bailouts, and the massive urban concrete projects we've discussed, the fact that we are still uncovering delicate, complex, new forms of life in our remaining forests is incredibly grounding.
It really is.
It serves as a stark reminder that the natural world possesses an intrinsic value and a quiet resilience that exists entirely independent of human utility or economic planning.
And we also saw a powerful conceptual pushback against top-down engineering right in Hyderabad, the same city struggling with the Musi riverfront project. Hyderabad just hosted the inaugural World Buddhist Peace Conference, which brought together delegates and thinkers from over 20 different countries.
What was truly compelling about the discourse at this conference was the framing. In a world currently obsessed with military posturing, peace treaties, and international summits, the delegates explicitly moved away from abstract political calls for peace.
They argued that true stability cannot be legislated. It cannot be engineered by a UN resolution or a massive infrastructure project. They focused instead on the necessity of inner transformation. The consensus was that ethical leadership, rooted in deep internal discipline and empathy, is the only actual foundation for lasting harmony. It is a profound counter-narrative to the idea that the state can simply mandate a solution to every crisis.
It suggests that while the structures of governance are necessary, they are ultimately hollow if they aren't guided by a fundamental understanding of human nature and ethical responsibility.
Which brings us to the end of an incredibly dense, far-reaching session today. Let's take a quick moment to pull all these massive threads together and just, see the tapestry we've uncovered.
We began by looking at the raw vulnerability of our global connections. We saw how a military commander's decision in the Strait of Hormuz paralyzed Indian ships, which instantly forced New Delhi to slash taxes, drain its exchequer to bail out oil companies, and dictate the fuel choices of domestic factories.
We watched India attempt to walk an impossible diplomatic tightrope signing defense checks to both Washington and Moscow in the same week, while trying to negotiate trade deals amidst the threat of American sanctions and managing the fallout of a youth-driven political revolution in Nepal.
And then we turned inward, examining the severe structural stress fractures within India itself. We explored the deep anxieties of the southern states who fear their economic success will cost them their political voice. We unpacked the fierce, painful debates over whether the state has the right to demand biological proof to validate a citizen's gender identity.
And finally, we looked at our physical environment. We saw the profound paradox of a government evicting citizens to build a beautiful riverfront while planning to flush toxic pharma waste with pristine drinking water, contrasted against the quiet, enduring survival of a newly discovered butterfly in the remote forests of Arunachal Pradesh.
Which leaves us with a central, unifying thought to mull over. If you look closely at every single source we dissected today, from the emergency shifting of fuel subsidies, to the mathematical attempts to engineer demographic representation, to the retroactive drawing of buffer zones, to the legislative redefinition of identity, you see governments desperately attempting to manage and engineer reality from the top down.
Right.
They are trying to build perfect, controllable systems. But as the Gen Z voters in Nepal demonstrated, as the displaced residents in Hyderabad are arguing, as the highly adaptable smuggling networks in Punjab prove, and as the delicate wings of a new butterfly remind us, life naturally, relentlessly resists being boxed in by bureaucratic master plans.
So the ultimate question we leave you with is this. What happens when the grand theoretical master plan finally collides with the messy, resilient, unpredictable reality of human nature and the natural world? Maybe the ultimate goal of governance shouldn't be to force the strings into a state of perfect, rigid tension. Maybe the goal is to finally learn how to play the complex, fragile instrument we actually have. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, guys. We know it was a long journey, but staying informed isn't just about collecting facts for the exam. It is about understanding the massive, invisible mechanisms that connect them. Take care and keep questioning the systems around you.